un crimen desconcertante y un policía que jamás estuvo allí. Bienvenidos a Eco Misteriosa, soy su anfitrión, Rvela. Cuéntame en los comentarios desde dónde nos escuchas hoy. Leerlo siempre hace especial esta experiencia. Comencemos. It was on a drizzling March morning, the kind where Baker Street's soot-streaked windows blurred the outside world into a melancholy smear of gray, that a most curious case came knocking at our door, though, peculiarly, without a knock at all. I had just returned from my rounds, having seen a rather tedious case of influenza at a solicitor's residence in Paddington, and was in the act of shedding my damp ulster coat when Holmes called out from the sitting-room with his usual mix of amusement and gravity. "Come, Watson. It appears Scotland Yard has finally stumbled upon a conundrum worth our time." I entered to find him standing at the window, hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed not on the street below but on a single sheet of paper upon the sill. His breakfast tray was untouched, and his Persian slipper repository of his tobacco lay upturned on the carpet, as though in the throes of some hastily risen thought. "Lestrade?" I asked, eyeing the note. Double quotes. "No, not this time, Inspector Gregson. If the stationery is to be trusted, and I always trust a man's choice of paper more than his choice of words." Holmes handed me the note without further ado. It was brief, written in a firm hand on official letterhead. "Sherlock Holmes, Esq. Consulting Detective 221B, Baker Street, March 14, 1893, sir. An incident has occurred at Bishop's Lane Police Station that defies logical explanation. A constable vanished during his shift inside a locked building, with no sign of departure or struggle. We are presently baffled. Your immediate counsel would be appreciated. Inspector Tobias Gregson, a policeman, disappeared." I asked, incredulous. Holmes smiled, that familiar wolfish curl to his lip. "Yes, Watson. Not a prisoner, not a civilian, but an officer of the law. Vanished during his watch, with the station door locked from the inside, and no one entering or leaving the premises during the time in question." "That's absurd. A man cannot simply dematerialize." Holmes turned from the window, seizing his coat. "Precisely why it merits investigation. Fetch your hat." We arrived at Bishop's Lane shortly before noon, the mist having lifted just glare enough to reveal a stout, uninspiring brick structure that looked more like a warehouse than a place of justice. Gregson greeted us at the door with none of his usual confidence. "Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for coming so swiftly." He ushered us in and closed the door behind us with care. "I'll tell you straightive, never seen anything like Kitty." We followed him into a narrow corridor, the gaslights flickering above, and came to a heavy wooden door marked "Duty Office." Constable Ernest Moffat reported for the midnight watch. He was seen entering this room alone at 11:45. The watchman on the next shift arrived at 4. The door was still locked from the inside. No answer to knocking. When we forced it, Gregson paused. No one was there. No sign of a struggle. Holmes asked, his sharp eyes already scanning the threshold. None. The logbook's last entry was at 1:03 a.m. Routine patrol note. All else intact. His coat hung neatly, his lamp burned out, his truncheon in place. Holmes stepped inside. The room was unremarkable. A desk, a single chair, a wall-mounted ledger, and a barred window no larger than a bread-box. He knelt beside the desk and inspected the legs, then pressed his fingertips lightly along the skirting board. "Who discovered the disappearance?" he asked without looking up. "Sergeant Denby arrived at 4 for relief. Knocked, got no answer, fetched another man, and broke the door." It took both their shoulders. Holmes rose, brushing invisible dust from his knees. "The lock, Standard Yale, no damage. The key was found inside, still in the drawer." "And the constable's boots?" Gregson blinked. Boots, well, I believe they were missing. Curious, Holmes murmured. The man disappears, but his coat remains. His boots vanish, yet his key is left behind. Do you keep a list of personnel on duty? Of course. I've compiled a full list. No unexplained entries or missing persons except Moffat. Then either Moffat left this room by a means not visible to the eye, or else he never left it at all. Holmes turned slowly, his gaze sweeping the walls. Has anyone considered the ceiling? Gregson frowned and looked up. A modest gas fixture hung in the center, but the plaster above bore no marks, no cracks, and certainly no hatch. Still too early for theories, Holmes said lightly. We must see the entire building. You mentioned something in your note, no entry or exit recorded during the interval. Gregson nodded. The front door was under watch all night, and the back entrance is barred and bolted. Then Holmes said with satisfaction, we are faced with a classic impossibility, my favorite genre. As we began our inspection, cookies of the station's perimeter, I could not help but feel that sense of uncanny unease that Holmes so often thrived on. A man had vanished not in a foggy alleyway or on a darkened moor, but from within the walls of Scotland Yard's own jurisdiction. There was something deeply troubling about that. Holmes turned to me, and his expression was unreadable. You see, Watson, he said softly, this is not merely a disappearance. It is a contradiction. And contradictions, if examined properly, often point the way to truth. We had scarcely completed our first slow circuit of the Bishop's Lane station when Holmes suddenly halted beside the outer wall, just beneath the narrow barred window of the duty office. He tilted his head upward, then crouched low to the earth, his fingers brushing the grit and mortar at the base of the foundation. Note, Watson, he said without turning. No boot marks. Not even the faintest impression beneath the window. Despite the soil here being damp from last night's rain, not a single scuff. No one climbed out this way. But surely no one could, I replied, peering upward. The window is barely wide enough for a child, and Moffat was, well, stocky, if I recall your description correctly. Indeed, according to Gregson, a former blacksmith, 17 stone, if an ounce. Holmes rose and dusted off his knees, the faintest glimmer of amusement lighting his eyes. So we are left with our contradiction. A man vanishes from a locked room, through no possible exit, without his boots but with no sign of his body. A conjuring trick, Watson, and not one I am inclined to credit to a street performer. We returned to the interior of the station, where Inspector Gregson had gathered the remaining night staff in the cantina, wary-looking Sergeant Denby and 2 constables, each still pale from the morning's discovery. Holmes sat himself on the edge of the long table with the comfortable ease of a man already feeling the lay of the land. "Gentlemen," he began, "I will not keep you long. You've endured a disturbance to routine, and nothing riles the soul of the uniformed man more than mystery within his own walls. I simply ask for precision. Sergeant Denby, at precisely what hour did you arrive to relieve Constable Moffat?" "A minute or 2 before 4, sir." "And what was your first indication that something was wrong?" "I knocked, as usual." No answer. Good. I waited another minute, knocked again. Louder. Nothing. Then I fetched Constable Price. Together we broke in. Took 2 tries with the shoulder. "You're sure the door was locked from within?" "Yes, sir. Bolt across the inside." Holmes nodded. "And you heard no sound from within? No movement? No cries?" "Not a thing. It was dead quiet." Holmes now turned to the constables. "Did either of you see or speak to Moffat during the shift?" The younger one, Wills, I believe, shook his head. "Not since just before midnight, sir. He'd brought in the last of the patrol reports, then said he was going to settle in." "And did he seem agitated, distracted?" Nervous? No, sir. Quite calm. Holmes stood and tapped his fingertips together, a sure sign that his mind was aligning scattered pieces into a framework. He paced twice along the perimeter of the canteen, then turned abruptly to Gregson. "Inspector, has any prisoner been in the cells in the last 24 hours? Yes, one drunkard, picked up around 10, released by 3. Sergeant Denby handled that, and no one else has had access to the station. No deliveries, visitors, or irregulars. None. The log confirms it." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Then, as we suspected, our field of suspects is narrow, but the mechanics, of the disappearance are where the real interest lies. Guy departed the station shortly after, stepping into the lighter fog of early afternoon. Holmes had entered that building with curiosity. He exited it with the air of a man carrying a splintered shard of certainty, though he said little as we hailed a cab back to Baker Street. It wasn't until we were settled once more by the fire that I ventured to speak. "You already see something, Holmes. I know that look." Holmes allowed himself a thin smile and plucked at the strings of his violin. He gave a soft, tuneless scrape. "There is something about absences, Watson," he said, gazing into the flames. "They are often more revealing than presences. Consider, a man goes missing. No sign of escape, no noise, no struggle. He vanishes, and yet there is no corresponding commotion, no broken lock, no outcry. His boots vanish, his coat does not. Key leaves behind a lamp, a logbook, a key. And what is the last thing he does before disappearing?" I leaned forward. "Writes in the logbook." "A routine patrol note," Gregson said. "Indeed, at 1:03 a.m. So we know, barring deception, that Moffat was alive and well at that time. Which raises a question. What would cause a man to leave his coat and vanish barefoot into a locked room, with no exit and no sound? Madness, I offered weakly. Some mental break. Holmes scoffed. Unlikely. A constable undergoing such an episode would not write a calm report minutes before vanishing. No, we must assume compos mentis. Now, Watson, what of the boots? What of them if you or I were to leave this flat? Would we forget our footwear? Especially on a March night? Certainly not. Exactly. So either the boots went with him, implying he departed voluntarily, or someone else removed them. And if they were removed by another, it must have occurred in that room, after his disappearance. Which is, of course, impossible. Holmes ceased fiddling with the violin and stood. "It is not the vanishing man that concerns me most, Watson. It is the silent key. Left in the drawer, and yet the door locked from inside. A contradiction only if we assume he locked the door at all." But Gregson said, "Yes, yes. But what if someone else locked the door after Moffat disappeared?" I stared at him. "Someone staged it." Holmes smiled with satisfaction. "Precisely. A locked room mystery is only insoluble when one accepts the room was truly locked at the time of the event. But suppose the door wasn't locked at the critical moment, suppose it was left ajar for some time, long enough for a perpetrator to do their work, then later closed and bolted from within, or by means unseen. From outside, with a clever arrangement," he murmured. He reached for a pencil and began to sketch quickly on a scrap of paper. I rose and peered over his shoulder. He had drawn a crude layout of the duty room desk door, window. Then he drew a length of string connecting the interior bolt to the desk. A loop, a weight, and an unattended room. Holmes said, "It would take no more than that." He stood and stretched, his eyes alight. "Watson, we are not dealing with a disappearance at all. We are dealing with an illusion of one. And that, I dare say, is far more dangerous. But who would go to such lengths?" Holmes stared out the window. That, my dear fellow, is what we must next discover. We need the personnel records for Bishop's Lane, the case files from the last 6 months, and access to Constable Moffat's residence. The man may be missing, but I suspect his shadow lingers in places we've yet to look. There was a knock at the door just then, and Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram on a silver tray. Holmes opened it, his eyes scanning the lines. His brow lifted. "Well," he said, folding it carefully, "the plot thickens. What is it?" "A report from Whitechapel. A woman claims to have seen a policeman matching Moffat's description wandering barefoot at 2 o'clock this morning. But here's the twist, Watson. She swears he was smiling, and his uniform was covered in coal dust." He turned toward me with the full force of his intent gaze. "We are not dealing with a vanishing we are chasing a man who wanted to disappear and who may already be halfway to wherever it is he intends to go." He paused. "Or someone wants us to believe he is." The following morning found Holmes in one of his less communicative moods. He had spent much of the night at the hearth, alternately pacing the room and scribbling brief notes, which he then folded with care and tucked into various envelopes. I watched him from my chair with the mild exasperation familiar to anyone who has lived long in the company of a man whose mind never ceases motion, even while his body remains deceptively still. When he finally spoke, it was without preamble. "The coal dust on Moffat's uniform is the fulcrum." I blinked. "The fulcrum, yes, Watson. The point on which the entire lever of this affair turns. If the woman in Whitechapel is to be believed, then Moffat did not simply vanish. He relocated, and he did so deliberately, under the illusion of impossibility. But what kind of man vanishes into a locked room and reappears in a work district miles away, barefoot, smiling, and smeared in soot? One fleeing the law, perhaps. Holmes inclined his head. Or one staging a narrative. Q.C. Watson. Too often men assume flight equals guilt. But a clever man, one well versed in how others think, might exploit that assumption. He crossed to the table where he had laid out a street map of London and drew his finger in a slow arc from Bishop's Lane to Whitechapel. The reported sighting was at 2 in the morning. That's 1 hour after the final logbook entry, allowing 10 minutes for preparation and departure. 22 navigate the escape route. That leaves 30 minutes unaccounted for. I furrowed my brow. What could he have done in that time? "That," Holmes said, "is precisely what we must determine. But first we must verify the sighting. Come, Watson, let us pay a visit to the woman who saw a ghost in uniform." By noon we had arrived at a narrow terrace off Brick Lane. The neighborhood was thick with the scent of coal, smoke, and last night's rain. Holmes led the way to number 11, a sagging building with peeling green shutters and a bent iron railing. A Mrs. Ivy Renfield greeted USA wiry widow with sharp features and the suspicious air of one long acquainted with petty crime. "I told the constable what I saw," she said, folding her arms. "Kim right past me. He did. Big fellow. Had that heavy walk, the kind you get from wearing thick boots, though he didn't have any on. Strange, that. And you're certain it was a constable?" Holmes asked, already scanning her small front room for signs of her habits. "Not merely a man in dark clothing. Don't take me for a fool, sir. Blue tunic, badge, helmet, though he'd taken that off and was carrying it. Looked like he'd been rolling in coal bins. But he was grinning, almost like he'd played a joke." "Did he speak to you?" "No, just gave me a nod, went down the alley and vanished into the fog." "What time?" "Couple of minutes. Past 2. I was out front, getting the milk bottles. Couldn't sleep." Holmes thanked her and led me outside. Once we were clear of the house, he exhaled with interest. "She's telling the truth. That's no memory fabricated for attention." She described the gate. The dust, the badge, too specific. You think it truly was Moffat? Almost certainly. But what concerns me is not that he was there. It's that he intended to be seen. Why else walk the alleyways of Whitechapel in full uniform, sans boots, in the middle of the night? I shrugged. To confuse us. To establish a false trail. This was theatre, Watson, but not for Mrs. Renfield's benefit, for ours. We returned to Baker Street, where Holmes immediately rang for a messenger and dispatched 3 notes to Gregson, requesting personnel and transfer records for Moffat's last 5 years. 1 to Mycroft, asking for railway watch lists, and the 3rd to a coal merchant on Bishop's Lane. Why the coal merchant? I asked. Holmes tapped his index finger against the arm of his chair. Because Moffat was covered in coal dust. Not ash, not soot, dust. The fine, clinging particulate one picks up not from fires, but from stockpiles, coal cellars, loading bays, storage bins. Then he passed through one, more than passed. I believe he entered one deliberately. There must be a nearby coal supply large enough to conceal a man for a time. Possibly the hiding place he used to exit the station unnoticed. But how? Holmes held up a hand. Let us not gallop, Watson, 1 step at a time. Great Station is flanked on one side by the rear of a bakery and on the other by a disused printer's. Both had coal-fired heating until recently. We'll visit both. It was the bakery that gave us our lead. A Mr. Collingham, the manager, showed us the old coal-shooter rusted iron hatch that opened into a deep basement cavern now used for storage. No deliveries any more, he said. Switched to gas last year, but the hatch still opens, if you've the strength for it. Holmes crouched and ran a gloved finger along the edge of the metal plate. He held it up and showed me the smear. Fresh dust, and boot marks, one set in, one out. See, I did. Barely perceptible prints, made by heavy soles. Now half. Holmes knelt again and examined the interior. Big enough to lie in. If someone entered here around 1 o'clock, they could remain hidden for a short interval, emerge once the street was empty, change clothing, and be off. Then Moffat escaped through the coal chute, likely with assistance. Assistance. Holmes stood. No man bolts a station door behind him and climbs into a coal bin alone. Watson. He had helped someone to lock the door, arrange the scene, collect the boots, possibly even log the last note. But who? That, my dear fellow, is our next riddle, and one we shall solve by examining Moffat's domestic life. We reached his lodgings in Holloway by late afternoon, a narrow set of rented rooms above a tobacconist's. The landlady, a Mrs. Edna Packham, was a talkative widow with little regard for boundaries, always punctual. "Mr. Moffat," she said, guiding us to his room. "Quiet, too. Paid rent every Tuesday. No fuss. But he's not been home since yesterday morning, and that's not like him." Holmes inspected the room with his usual precision. It was modest but orderly. A clean bed, a single wardrobe, and a writing desk with an ink blotter and neatly stacked papers. He opened the top drawer and retrieved a folded letter, which he read in silence. "Well," I prompted. Holmes handed it to me. It was addressed to my dearest Charles, and signed only G. It spoke of longing, secrecy, and hope for a new life away from London. Seat. The language was affectionate, but restrained, carefully phrased, but unmistakably romantic. "Charles is Moffat?" I asked. "Almost certainly. G may be our accomplice." Holmes turned to the wardrobe and pulled back a false panel at the rear. There, in a slim crevice, was a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside, a civilian overcoat, worn walking shoes, and a railway timetable for departures from King's Cross dated that very morning. "He had a plan," Holmes murmured. "New clothing, transport, and an ally. A rendezvous was set. But whether he made it or whether the plan went Aries, another matter. He straightened and turned to me. We now know that Constable Moffat faked his disappearance with the help of another, possibly a lover. He concealed his movements, planted a false trail, and vanished. But to what end? Holmes gave a rare smile. That, Watson, is what makes this delicious. Because every illusion, no matter how clever, conceals not just a truth but a motive. And I intend to find it. As the gas lamps flickered on across London, we made our way back through the mist, the mystery growing deeper with every step. It was well past 8 when we returned to Baker Street, our boots damp and our collars turned, up against the fine sleet that had begun to drift down across the city. Mrs. Hudson had left a pot of strong Assam by the fire, and Holmes poured himself a cup absently, eyes distant, thoughts clearly still pacing the narrow coal chute behind Bishop's Lane Station. I, meanwhile, found myself caught between admiration and unease. The events of the day had rearranged the contours of the case entirely. What had seemed a confounding disappearance was now emerging as something altogether stranger, premeditated vanishing act, executed with skill, cunning, and apparent assistance. And yet the central question remained unanswered. "Holmes," I said at last, "I understand how Moffat might have escaped the station. But why? What reason would a policeman, by all accounts reliable and sound of mind, have for orchestrating such a thing? It wasn't panic. He planned this in advance." Holmes took a slow sip of tea, then set the cup aside and leaned back in his chair. "A fair question, Watson. I've considered 3 possibilities thus far. The first, he fled from danger. Perhaps he was being blackmailed or threatened. The second, he fled for love, as the letter from G suggests. And the third, Holmes' eyes sharpened. He fled as part of a larger scheme. One, not of escape, but of strategy." I raised an eyebrow. "Strategy? What sort? That is what we must determine. But consider, this is no ordinary desertion. He leaves behind not only his post, but a locked-room mystery. He covers himself in coal dust and makes himself conspicuous in Whitechapel. Why leave a trail if you truly mean to disappear?" "Unless," I murmured, "he wanted to confuse the investigation." "Precisely, Smoke, Watson. Not from coal, but from misdirection." Before I could respond, a knock came at the door. Holmes rose swiftly and admitted none other than Inspector Gregson, whose expression was far more agitated than it had been the day before. I thought it best to bring this myself. He said without greeting, handing Holmes a folder with the yard's crest, "Personnel and disciplinary records for Moffat, as requested. Theft. But that's not all. I've news that may shift your thinking." Holmes gestured him to sit, then opened the file. His eyes scanned rapidly, decorated twice. "Commendation from Superintendent Maynard. Transferred from Bow Street 2 years ago. No recorded infractions." "Now read the 3rd page," Gregson said. Holmes did, and his brow lifted. "A suppressed inquiry. Yes, internal complaint, never filed formally." The language was vague. Inappropriate associations, uncompromised judgment. But the note was attached to a separate memo from the Criminal Intelligence Division. Apparently Moffat was suspected of fraternizing with an informant connected to the Dunsany ring. I stiffened. "The forgers?" Gregson nodded. "Still operating, though we've arrested several of their men. They're clever in official documents. Passes, permits, identity papers. We've been chasing their printer for over a year. And now, just this morning, he pulled another paper from his coat. A railway inspector at King's Cross reported a scuffle between 2 men near the luggage office. One fled. The other, when questioned, produced a constable's badge. "Whose?" Holmes asked. Gregson hesitated. "Ernest Moffat's. Holmes leaned forward, alert, and the man carrying it, gone, disappeared into the crowd. The room was silent for a moment. Then Holmes said, "Watson, fetch the map again." Gregson pointed to the location of the incident. I laid the map on the desk, and Gregson tapped it. South Concourse. Near the east gate, Holmes traced a path with his finger. So Moffat stages his disappearance just after 1. By 2, he is seen in Whitechapel. By dawn, a man is caught with his badge at King's Cross. If it was Moffat, he covered a wide circuit in just a few hours. Or someone wanted us to believe it was Moffat, I said. Holmes nodded approvingly. "Quite right, Watson. Let us reframe the situation. Suppose the man in Whitechapel wasn't Moffat, but someone dressed to appear as him. That would imply Moffat's plan included more than misdirection. It included impersonation." Gregson frowned. "But for what purpose?" Holmes rose, his voice sharpening. "Suppose, Gregson, you wished to insert someone into a secure location under an assumed identity, a document forger, perhaps moving under police disguise. What would you require?" "A uniform," Gregson said slowly. "A badge, credentials, preferably from a real officer." "Exactly. So if Moffat colluded with the Dunsany ring and agreed to vanish in order to give his identity to another man, then everything falls into place. The locked room, the missing boots, the sighting in Whitechapel, they all serve a single aim: to confuse us long enough for someone else to become Ernest Moffat." "But why would Moffat agree to such a thing?" I asked. "It's treasonous." Holmes was already pacing. "Because he loved someone. Because he was compromised. Or most intriguingly, because he intended to double-cross them. The letter from G may have been real. The flight, planned. But the man with his badge this morning, that may not have been part of his plan at all." Gregson rubbed his brow. "So what do we do?" Holmes stopped pacing. "Simple. We bait the hook. Someone has assumed Moffat's identity. That means they will attempt to use that identity for travel, perhaps, or to retrieve forged documents. We make it known, discreetly, that Bishop's Lane is conducting a sweep of old case files. We leak word that Moffat's disappearance is now considered a criminal act that will force our counterfeit constable to act quickly. Act how? To destroy the evidence or silence anyone who knows the truth. Which brings us to G." Gregson stood. "I'll have men put on the railway terminals and the forgery contacts we know. I'll also search Moffat's financial, see if he drew anything unusual in the last month." "Good," Holmes said. "And Watson and I will locate G. We must reach them before someone else does." Gregson departed, and Holmes wasted no time. He brought out the letter once more and read it aloud, slowly, listening to its cadence. "My dearest Charles, I am tired of waiting. If you truly mean it this time, meet me in the place you spoke of, where the smoke climbs high and no one looks down." I frowned. "That's poetic. It's also telling. Where the smoke climbs high. That suggests a chimney, a foundry, perhaps a factory." I stood beside him. "And no one looks down." Holmes snapped his fingers. "The rooftop." Within the hour, we were off to investigate a series of disused buildings in East London, factories and workshops, once coal-fed and now derelict, perfect for a secret meeting. By late evening, we had narrowed it to one, a former soapworks. In Limehouse, its upper floor still accessible by a rusted iron stair. Holmes found recent footprints in the soot-streaked, dust-to-sets, leading to a door beneath a crumbling chimney stack. We entered cautiously. The room was dark, save for a single candle on the sill, and there, seated on a crate, her coat drawn tightly about her, was a woman in her 30s, with pinched features, watchful eyes, and a traveling bag at her feet. Holmes doffed his hat. "Miss G." She stood slowly. "Who are you?" My name is Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. We've come about Charles Moffat." The woman hesitated, then gave a single nod. "Is he all right?" "That depends entirely on who's asking. You signed your letter only with an initial. You understand our caution." She looked down, fingers clenched. "My name is Grace Linley. Charles and we were to leave this week. He said everything was arranged. He was going to disappear and start again. He said the uniform was a prison. And what did he promise you? A new life. In Canada. Papers. Passage. He said he had connections." Holmes crouched to examine the candle wax on the floor. "Still warm. You've been here recently. Every night since Sunday. He was supposed to meet me 3 nights ago." Holmes straightened. "And he didn't come?" "No." Watson spoke gently. "Do you know if Charles had dealings with a man named Calville, or any connection to forged documents?" Grace flinched. "Only what he hinted. That someone owed him a favor. That they'd arranged things quietly. He didn't say names." Holmes' face was grave. "Miss Linley, I believe Charles may have been used, and I fear he may now be in danger." She clutched her coat tighter. "Then help him, please." Holmes nodded. "And we shall. But to do so, we must first find out who replaced him." He turned to me, his voice low. "Tomorrow, Watson, we go to the forgers. The game is no longer about a disappearance. It's about an identity stolen and a man caught in the middle of it." The fog was particularly thick the next morning, coiling through the alleys of London like a living thing, muffling wheels, swallowing footsteps, and turning gas lamps into dim smudges of amber glow. Holmes seemed to relish it. As we stepped from Baker Street, he remarked almost cheerfully, "A day made for shadows, Watson. And we are chasing men who have made shadows their home." Our destination was a pawnbroker's shop in Clockenwell, crumbling facade with a crooked sign that read, "Levings, Curios, and Lending." To the untrained eye, it was a place where rusted watches and battered violins went to die. To Holmes, it was a known haunt of individuals who trafficked not in heirlooms, but in identities. The man behind the counter was gaunt, balding, with a long scar across his jaw. He looked up as we entered and tensed visibly. "Mr. Leffing," Holmes said smoothly, doffing his hat. "Or do you prefer your other name, Henry Colville of Clockenwell Printworks?" The man did not answer. Holmes advanced, his voice quiet but firm. "We don't intend to make a scene. But I believe one of your recent clients, an officer of the Metropolitan Police, arranged for papers to be forged. Specifically, a new identity. We'd like to know for whom." "You're mad," the man muttered. "I've never—" Holmes leaned forward. "If you prefer to be taken in by Inspector Gregson and questioned for 20 hours without tea, you're welcome to continue denying it. But let me offer you a better option. Tell me the name, and you can consider yourself still in business by nightfall." Leving's expression hardened. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he reached beneath the counter and withdrew a small black ledger. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "So easy. Because the man you're asking about scared the hell out of me," Leffing muttered. "And he wasn't a policeman. He was pretending to be one. Came in 4 nights ago. Showed me a badge reel, but borrowed. Said he wanted papers for travel to sets. Canada and France. Did he give a name? First he used Charles Moffat, but when I pressed him for real, identification just enough to create a trail, he said his name was Victor Nunn. Not that I believe it." Holmes' eyes flickered. "Did he say who the second set was for?" "No. Paid cash. Left within 10 minutes. Describe him." Leffing frowned. 35 or so. Northern accent. Maybe Manchester. Clean-shaven. Wore the uniform like it didn't fit. He kept his right hand in his pocket the whole time. I thought maybe it was injured." Holmes made a note. One more question. Has he returned since? No, but he said he might. To collect the second set, the Canadian ones. Holmes' tone grew colder. And when were those to be ready? Today. We exited the shop without another word. Holmes was silent as we turned onto the main street, but I could see his thoughts running with ferocious speed. "Do you believe him?" I asked. "Completely. He has the look of a frightened man, not a liar. And now we have a name Victor Nunn. Whether genuine or not, it gives us a string to pull." We returned to Scotland Yard to consult the records. Holmes spent over an hour cross-referencing known associates of the Dunsany ring. Gregson joined us midway through, bringing a thick dossier. "We found activity near King's Cross. A warehouse was broken into last night, nothing stolen. But someone was definitely inside. We think it was a rendezvous point." Holmes flipped through the file. "Here, none. Arrested in 1894, passing counterfeit clerical licenses in Durham. Released on lack of evidence. Known associate of Alfred Dunsany's brother-in-law. Used aliases in Manchester, Leeds, and Bath." "So he's real," I said. "Real enough," Holmes replied. "And now, impersonating a constable, he must be planning to move soon." Gregson tapped the desk. "Then we can catch him when he returns." "For the Canadian papers." "Perhaps," Holmes murmured. "But I suspect we have little time. If he learns Moffat's disappearance is being treated as foul play, he'll flee before dusk." He stood abruptly. "We must speak with the one man who might know where Nunn is hiding. Someone who dealt with Moffat closely, someone in the station who—" Cry asked. Holmes' eyes narrowed. "Sergeant Denby." Within the hour we were back at Bishop's Lane. The fog had begun to lift, but the station felt no less oppressive. Denby met us in the rear office, a cup of weak tea in one hand and a furrow accent on his brow. "Back again, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes cut to the point. "You and Moffat worked together frequently. Were you aware of any personal connections he might have had outside the force?" Denby shrugged. "Not really. He was private, kept to himself, liked to read, took walks, after shift. Did he ever mention a man named Nunn?" "No." Holmes studied the sergeant closely. "What about Colville? The name mean anything to you?" Denby stiffened. "No." That hesitation was microscopic, but Holmes saw it. "You hesitated," he said softly. "Why?" Denby opened his mouth, then shut it. His face was rigid now. "I don't want trouble, Mr. Holmes." "Then speak plainly." Denby leaned forward. "About 6 weeks ago, Moffat started receiving visits during his breaks. Same man each time, short fellow. Wore gloves. Always looked over his shoulder. One night I asked who it was. Moffat said, just an old friend ex-army. I didn't pry. But I saw the same man again outside the tobacconist's where Moffat lived, waiting in the alley. Could you identify him?" "If I saw him again, yes." Holmes nodded. "Then you shall. Come with us. That evening we set our trap at Leving's Curios. The blinds were drawn, and a single oil lamp burned behind the counter. Denby waited in the back room, ready to confirm the identity. We did not wait long. Just past 7, the door opened. A man stepped inside neatly dressed in a constable's tunic, though the boots were scuffed and the hat pulled low. He approached the counter with purpose. Holmes stepped forward, blocking his path. "Victor Nunn." He said that. The man froze. His hand darted toward his coat, but Holmes was faster. With a quick motion he struck the man's wrist, sending a small revolver clattering to the floor. Gregson, hidden behind a curtain, stepped out and seized him in the brief scuffle that followed. Denby entered and his eyes widened. "That's him," he said. "That's the man who visited Moffat." The man sneered but said nothing. Holmes crouched to pick up the fallen revolver. No safety. Loaded. You weren't coming to collect documents. You were coming to silence Leffing. A pity you're too late. As Gregson clapped on the manacles, Holmes turned to me. Now we know. Victor Nunn intended to take Moffat's place perhaps permanently. He forged papers, staged a false disappearance, and nearly pulled it off. But where's Moffat? I asked. Holmes' face grew grave. That, Watson, is the final piece. None would not leave a loose end. If Moffat is still alive, we must find him. If not, then we must learn where the body is buried. The man in cuffs gave a dry chuckle. You'll never find him, he said. He got clever, too clever. Holmes stepped forward, his voice like steel. And clever men make mistakes. One of yours, Mr. Nunn, was underestimating the value of a forged timetable. The man's smile faded. Holmes turned to Gregson. Search the Limehouse warehouses. Focus on those with coal storage. We may yet find Moffat alive. As we stepped out into the night, Holmes lit his pipe and exhaled slowly into the fog. One impostor captured, he murmured. Now let us find the man he tried to erase. The dawn broke cold and colorless as we made our way to Limehouse once more, the mist clinging to the Thames like a shroud. Holmes, despite the wear of the long night, strode with that peculiar alertness which always overtook him when the final pattern of a mystery had begun to reveal itself. His steps were quick, his expression remote, and he spoke very little, save for occasional murmurs that sounded less like conversation and more like internal calculations spoken aloud. The forger did not lie. He said once more to the wind than to me. Nunn arranged 2 sets of papers, one for himself, one possibly for a corpse. But if that second set wasn't intended for Grace Linley, then who? You think he planned to murder Moffat and use his papers for another man entirely? I asked. Something like that, Holmes replied. But plans that elaborate require contingencies, safe places, a temporary prison, not just a grave. We arrived at the mouth of West India Dock Road and turned down a narrow spur where disused warehouses leaned into one another like drunks in conversation. Holmes had narrowed our list to 4, based on proximity to both the old soapworks and the coal merchants' yard places already implicated in Nunn's trail. The third on our list stood squat and dark, with a rusted padlock that gave way beneath Gregson's crowbar after a few minutes' determined effort. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of coal dust and mold. The interior was little more care than a storage cavern. Crates piled haphazardly, tarpaulins covered in bird droppings, a cracked cistern in one corner. But Holmes advanced with purpose, his lantern casting slow arcs of light across the shadowed space. "Gregson," he said, "take the west wall, Watson, with me." We moved toward the bank of coal hoppers at the rear large metal bins once used for stoking fires in the great steam boilers. Holmes ran his hands along the lip of one, then dropped to his knees and struck a match. "There," he said quietly. "At first I saw nothing. Then the flame caught a glint metal. No, I say man's face, pallid, smeared with soot." "In coal dot," I gasped. Moffat. Holmes reached in and grasped the wrist, pulse faint, but alive. See, we dragged him free, coughing and barely conscious. His uniform was torn and bloodied at the sleeve, and one boot was missing. As we laid him on the floor, Holmes poured a few drops of water from his flask onto the man's lips. Moffat stirred. "Weakly, Holmes," he croaked. He took everything." "You're safe now," Holmes said. "Rest. We have you." Moffat closed his eyes. Gregson appeared behind us, astonished. "Good God, you found him." "Barely in time," Holmes said grimly. "None must have left him here, expecting to return once the papers were in hand. Possibly to kill him, or simply to leave him to die of cold and hunger. "He's not well," I said. "We must get him to a doctor." A cab was summoned, and Moffat taken to a surgery in Stepney under police guard. As we stood outside watching the cab vanish into the haze, Holmes turned to Gregson with quiet resolve. Now we tied the final knots. We returned to Baker Street, where Holmes, despite our fatigue, refused rest. He gathered the evidence, Moffat's letter from Grace Linley, Leving's ledger, the forged railway timetable, the coal bin footprints, and the badge found on Nunn, and laid them across the table like pieces on a chessboard. The game, as they say, is afoot. He began to speak as if to an audience unseen. Nunn intended to disappear abroad under an assumed identity. To do so, he required not only forged papers but a credible backstory, something that would pass scrutiny. He chose Moffat because the man was disciplined, solitary, and already half forgotten by his superiors, easy to impersonate. None visited him under false pretenses, I added, following his logic. He earned his trust, perhaps blackmailed him, or perhaps they struck a deal. Precisely, Holmes said. But Moffat changed his mind, perhaps because of Grace, or perhaps because he saw the true cost. Either way, Nunn acted swiftly. He drugged or subdued him, the torn sleeve I noted, and imprisoned him in the coal hopper. Then staged the Lockroom illusion. He planted the badge, had a decoy wear the uniform in Whitechapel to be seen, and tried to vanish. But he needed the real Moffat alive until the forged documents were completed, so that he could mine any final details, or kill him only when escape was certain. "But we got to Leffing first," I said, "and Moffat lived." Holmes smiled faintly, and thus our impostor's game collapsed. That evening we returned to Stepney to speak with Moffat, who had revived somewhat after rest and nourishment. He lay on a narrow bed, pale but alert, his right arm bandaged and his voice raw. He called himself Victor. He said, "I didn't know his real name. Said he worked for the press. Knew things, details about my transfer history, the Dunsany ring investigation. Even my father's death. Said he could make things disappear. Debts, records. You agreed to help him?" Holmes asked softly. "At first, I didn't mean to, but he knew about Grace. Said if I didn't help, he'd tell the Yard she was a part of the forgery ring. She's innocent. She didn't know anything."